Hey everybody, welcome back to the Horror Trans podcast. My name is Stephanie Bree. This podcast is a companion piece to the Horror Trans YouTube channel where I, a transgender woman, talk about all things horror. The purpose of the podcast is to dive into the things that don't fit into the format of the review show, which is a simple rent or buy. I could adapt it for video games, but TV shows are a little bit harder. Board games and things of that nature. So here we are. I got a lot of topics today, and I try to keep this show within the 60-minute framework, more or less. But I'm willing to go over if necessary. So our first topic, continuing a series of discussions I've been having previously. We're all the way up to survival horror games in the video game world. Now, I've previously talked about the early hints of what would become the survival horror franchise, or excuse me, not franchise, genre, with some of the 16-bit, 8-bit horror games that laid the groundwork for later survival horror games, but now we're in the meat and potatoes. So there are 4 or 5 really big, popular survival horror franchises that I want to talk about. The first one is Alone in the Dark. The second one is Silent Hill. The third one is House of the Dead. The fourth one is Resident Evil. And the fifth one is a surprise for those who keep listening or watching if you're on the YouTube. So we'll go in order. We'll start with Alone in the Dark. Alone in the Dark is essentially one of the first what we would call survival horror games. It was released on PCs and then also 3DO, PlayStation, and I believe Saturn. And then it continued for a spell, and then it just fell off the face of the earth. I don't know if I would go so far as to call Alone in the Dark a dead franchise, but it's certainly in a fucking coma at the very least. The next one is Silent Hill, which has more in common with Alone in the Dark than it does the 3 others I want to talk about. A lot more in common. Silent Hill is also not really a dead franchise. It is sort of on life support, but it had its heyday back in the PS1, PS2 era, and then just sort of fizzled out over time as Konami kind of shot themselves in the foot, and as they continue to bleed out, we're just like, well, are they going to save them or not? We don't know yet. They're still fucking bleeding out in the ER. So, the jury's out on if they're going to survive. But as of right now, the Silent Hill franchise is basically in shambles. There's allegedly another Silent Hill tie-in or something in the franchise coming, but I'm not going to fucking talk about it that much. The next one is, I mentioned, House of the Dead. Now, House of the Dead is interesting because some would argue it's not really survival horror. It's just a light gun game. To which I would reply, true technically, as would also be the case with Carnival, but you are in a mansion overrun with zombies, and the point of the game is to kill all the zombies to survive the horror movie that you're watching unfold. So yeah, I think it counts as a survival horror. And again, as you're going to see as a pattern with survival horror, this franchise is also more or less dead or on life support or in a coma. Next, we have Resident Evil, which is of the legacy survival horror franchises I'm going to talk about, those that originated on PC and PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2 era. Resident Evil is the most healthy of those survival horror franchises. In that, they still get new games, they still get new movies and merch and toys and tie-ins, etc. all the fucking time. So Resident Evil is alive and well and healthy as ever. Resident Evil is somewhat different than the first 2 survival horror games I talked about, Alone in the Dark and Silent Hill, in that Resident Evil has a lot more action to it than those two. But it has more in common with House of the Dead in that it's also an action game. But Resident Evil does also have the, puzzle solving and mystery solving and surviving and stealth and all that stuff that you come to expect from a survival horror game. So it very much does count. And finally, we're going to get to the big ass goddamn elephant in the room. Five Nights at Freddy's, also known as FNAF. Fuck off. I will never play FNAF. I have a deathly, illogical fear, irrational fear of dolls. This includes not dolls, but like scary dolls, ceramic dolls, ventriloquist dummies, Cabbage Patch dolls, and yes, anima fucking tronics, which is why I'll never go to Disney World because fuck no. And this video game is all about animatronics. Killer fucking demon-possessed animatronics. No thank you, I'll pass. Now, in full disclosure, as is the case with the horror games I mentioned in the previous segments, 8-bit and 16-bit, I have not played as many of these survival horror games as you would expect from someone who is a horror movie aficionado. That's because I like my horror movies to be passive entertainment, not active entertainment, like video games. So while I do enjoy things like Castlevania or Resident Evil, House of the Dead, etc., I'm not really into being scared too much in a video game because that avatar represents me in the game, and I don't want to fucking die in a game. So Alone in the Dark and FNAF and Silent Hill really don't speak to me. Now, since we've already included Resident Evil, and we've already included House of the Dead, and by extension Carnival, which is another fantastic fucking game, let's go ahead and throw another monkey wrench in this discussion and talk about the first-person shooter, Fear, which was released in the PS3, Xbox 360 era, I believe. Also Windows XP era. So, Fear, I would argue, is a survival horror game, even though its gameplay is first-person shooter. Now, you start to get into the weeds too far, then you're going to call Castlevania survival horror, and then if you're not careful, you're calling Doom survival horror. So I want to be careful. Not everything with horror elements or scares in it, jump scares, is going to be survival horror. This is where things get muddy. And look, I'm old. I don't keep up with trends. I don't know what's on PS4 or PS5 all that much. So I don't know what is out there in the survival horror genre outside of what I just talked about, because that's the extent of my knowledge. So I don't know if the genre is alive and well, if it's been supplanted, replaced, if it's folded into something or evolved or morphed into something new. I don't know. So I'm going to ask you a question and you let me know in the comments. Do you consider The Last of Us survival horror? I consider The Last of Us a FMV game or a story-driven adventure game. So more or less, cut to the chase, it's an interactive movie. And as far as I'm concerned, interactive movies are genre independent. It's an interactive movie. I don't give a fuck what genre it is. It's an interactive movie. So that's my stance on The Last of Us. But maybe you disagree with me. If so, let me know. And what's your reasoning? And if you do happen to agree with me, then please, by all means, back me up. So now we're going to talk about a TV series that I think is fan-fucking-tastic, and I do want to do a rent-or-buy-esque type review on the channel eventually, if I can ever figure out how to do that with a TV show. Because it's complicated. Are you recommending individual episodes, entire seasons, the show as a whole? You know what I mean? It's difficult. I've already talked about Stranger Things on this series, but Netflix actually struck gold again with another horror franchise. The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. Now, as a huge fan of Sabrina the Teenage Witch, the live action TGIF sitcom from the 90s starring Melissa Joan Hart, as well as the Archie comics that it's all based on. Yes, I do have Archie comics. And Sabrina's one that I read. I am a fan of Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, and I do have the graphic novel that I don't know if I would say the series is based on, or that's based on the series, but the tie-in. I'll call it a tie-in until I can confirm one way or the other which way it goes. Chilling Adventures of Sabrina takes a darker tone to the Sabrina the Teenage Witch mythos. Instead of being a teen comedy like the comics and the sitcom, this is a straight horror show. It's got characters that die. It's got dark magic. It has evil demon possessions. Lilith, the Queen of Hell, is the mastermind behind the series. Lucifer, also known as Satan, also known as the Great One, I guess is what they call him. I don't remember. Makes a prominent appearance in this series. Sabrina herself, the plot is pretty much Sabrina is, baptized under a dark baptism into the cult. I can't remember what the coven is called, but the cult of the coven. And is using her evil powers, her dark magic, to lure Lucifer out into the real world so she can trap him so that he is no longer a problem. She's also beefing with Lilith, who is another big bad in the series, and eventually takes her spot on the throne as Queen of Hell. This is pretty fucking dark for what used to be a kid's show. They actually call Joshua and his father, Yahweh, the false god. They refer to the Bible as the false prophecy. So this show is definitely dark compared to what you're used to with Sabrina the Teenage Witch. Which is sort of good in a way because it's a loose tie-in to the also dark Riverdale, which aired on the CW network, which was a darker tone horror movie take on the Archie mythos, which was pretty fucking awesome. I loved Riverdale as well. But Chilling Adventures of Sabrina is also interesting because Sabrina herself does embrace her evil side, her dark powers, and accepts that she's the Queen of Hell. And that, to me, is something Melissa Joan Hart's Sabrina would have never fucking done. So kudos to Netflix for doing that. There is a lot of death in Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. And much like Buffy the Vampire Slayer before it, a lot of the death is permanent. Not always, but a lot of it is. As a transgender person, I should point out that there is a very accurate representation of a transgender person on the show. So a thumbs up for that as well. And this show does a really good job capturing the essence of what you're familiar with. So like the ants, you have the one ant that is the dark, committed to the coven, loves the Dark Lord, loves the dark arts, follows the rules. And then you have the ditzy sister, who has always been a ditzy sister. So kudos to her for remaining true to the essence of the character. And then you have Sabrina, who is on the surface relatively innocent and pure looking. She's a blonde girl with blue eyes and fair skin. But she has a dark heart and a secret, which is what drives the show. The show has a lot of good horror elements to it, especially involving demons and witchcraft and mythology. And it also has a lot of great special effects for the type of show it is. Better, I would say, than the TGIF Sabrina from the 90s. No disrespect to my beloved Melissa Joan Hart, mind you. I'm just saying this show does it better. And not even having Punky Brewster grown up as an adult tips the scales back in your favor. I'm sorry. That being said, I have not finished Chilling Adventures of Sabrina for a couple of reasons. One, I no longer have Netflix. And frankly, I have no desire to go back to Netflix. I left it for a reason. I just wasn't finding anything to fucking watch on it. The other reason is this is a scary show. And so I took a break because it was getting really fucking intense. And I wanted to take a break and let it cool off. But I took too long of a break. So when I tried to go back to it, I couldn't remember what episode I was on. I couldn't remember what was happening in the show. And I didn't want to jump in the middle, not really remembering what was happening. But I also didn't want to go back to the beginning and start over because it's a slog. So I gave up on the show. Me personally, I gave up. Like I said, I did buy the graphic novel, which I did read through. I enjoyed it. So I have a vague idea of probably what happens in the show. But at the same time, there's a possibility I go back and give it another go. But I'm not sure if and or when that will be. Now, I'm burning through these topics relatively fast, which is why I have 4 topics this week instead of the usual 3. The next topic might not take very much time either. So I'm hoping the 4th one will, although it's hard to say at this point. So I might just pencil in a 5th topic just for the fuck of it. We'll see. But all things considered, I do recommend watching Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. And if you can get through it, either in a binge or in microdoses, good on you. I had to take a break because this is an actual scary show and it is very heavy and very dark. I was raised Catholic, well, Baptist and then Catholic. So I initially went into this show with some trepidation. Next, I'm going to offend fucking every horror fan on the planet because I don't know how you say his name. So we're talking about M. Night Shyamalan, who gives a fuck. I don't know how to say his name. I've heard it Shyamalan, Shyamalaya Ding Dong. I've heard it so many different ways I don't know how you're supposed to say it. I'm sorry. No disrespect to the man. I just don't know how to say your name because nobody says it the same way. So I don't know what's correct. I'm not trying to be disrespectful in that regards. However, he gets a middle finger and a fuck you piece of shit for the goddamn garbage he has unleashed on the world. So it goes all the way back to the late 90s where he pulled the wool over our eyes and then kicked us in the nuts with The Sixth Sense. He literally fucking duped every goddamn buddy. And because his piece of shit ass got away with it, we let him do it again with Signs. And then he's like, oh, cool, I got away with it twice. So we let him get away with it again with The Village. And then I'm like, you know what? Fuck you, I'm tapping out. So yes, my experience with M. Night Shyamalan, or however you say it, is those 3 movies and go to fucking hell. I ain't watching anything else that asshole ever makes. Ever. I am not doing it. Fuck you and your goddamn fake ass, fake out twist endings and your piece of shit bullshit, long ass storytelling. You should have made all 6 of your movies, or however many you made, should have been one goddamn anthology because they're all too goddamn long for what the fuck they are. There's not enough meat in his movies to make a 90-minute to 2-hour movie. Yet he keeps making 90-minute to 2-hour movies. What the actual fuck, dude? Just cut them all down to a fucking 2.5 hour anthology, and then retire, you motherfucker. God damn it. If you haven't noticed, I fucking hate M. Night Shyamalan, or however the fuck you say his name. Shyamalan? Shyamalan? I don't know how to say it. I'm sorry. I don't like this guy. And I will not watch Cabin in the Lost Woods, or whatever the fuck it's called. The Beach of Eternity, or whatever the fuck it's called. Or anything else this motherfucker puts his name on. I won't do it. Because this asshole burned me 3 times in a row, and I said, fuck you, I ain't doing this again. I ain't fucking doing this again. You get 3 strikes, asshole. You got your 3 strikes. So, let's talk about a new topic. True crime. This one might have some legs. I get asked all the time, or told all the time, or assumed by people all the time, that I must be into true crime, right? Because I love horror so much. Not really, but not necessarily, no. So, alright. Let's see if I can unpack this in a way that makes sense. I do not, by and large, like true crime shows. This would be detective shows or drama, crime dramas. This would also be like unsolved mysteries, or how to catch a killer, or whatever the fuck it's called, or any of those fucking rubbish shows. I don't like them. Not because I don't have an interest in serial killers or true crime necessarily, because I obviously do. It's just I'm not a fan of the fucking format. It literally, like, it takes something, how it ends. You know who the killer is. You know they're in fucking prison and or dead. You already know this, but they string you along with all these fake out red herrings where it's like, I already know it was Jeffrey Dahmer. You don't have to do the fake out. Was it his cousin? Was it the priest down the street? Was it his sister? No, we already know it was fucking Jeffrey Dahmer, assholes. Just come out with it. God damn it. That's why I hate true crime shows. Jesus fucking Christ. Just come out with it. We don't need the goddamn string along. Fuck. The other thing I don't like about true crime shows is they're boring as fuck. A lot of time, and they're one-sided, and we're going to talk about that too. Boring because a lot of times it's police reports and witness statements and just sort of piecing things together after the fact as best we can with the knowledge we have available to us. Sometimes you get reenactments, sometimes you don't. The better ones have good reenactments, but the shitty ones either don't have them at all or have really fucking cheesy Lifetime quality reenactments, which is like, oh my god, give me a fucking break. Hire actors, god damn it. So there are a lot of them are boring as fuck. The other thing is they're one-sided. They almost always interview the cops and the families of the victims, families and or surviving friends of the victims. Occasionally you'll get a Sidney Prescott situation where one of the victims survived and didn't die, or potential victims or targeted victims, etc. So they'll interview them from time to time. For whatever reason, a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times, these true crime shows don't even bother to interview the killer themselves or close personal friends of the killer or family members of the killer. They usually are just very one-sided. It's the cops and the victims, or families and survivors of the victims. So you're getting he's a piece of shit. He was always a piece of shit. He deserves to rot in prison. I wish they would give him the chair, but they won't. Fucking narrative. So you don't usually get they don't talk to his or her therapist, to find out what was the underlying cause of his psychosis, his crimes. You don't get a lot of first-hand accounts. Now, to be fair, a lot of these serial killers either don't get caught, which happens, or they die in the process, either through execution because that was their sentence, or old age, or they kill themselves along the way, or whatever. So you can't really interview a corpse, unfortunately. I mean, not in the traditional sense. I mean, yeah, sure, you could have a seance, but there's some question as to how accurate and or believable that even is. So let's just sweep that under the rug for right now. Occasionally, they will consult either the police and therefore the filmmakers themselves, or just the filmmakers for the fuck of it, a psychic or a person claiming to be psychic for whatever reason. And they'll talk about, I had this vision, or I saw this piece of evidence, or whatever. So sometimes you'll get a little insight through that, but again, it's like, how much do you put stock into a psychic's insight? You know what I mean? Sometimes you'll get a psychologist or a criminologist or a FBI profiler, a serial killer profiler, who will profile the serial killer, but it's not necessarily always or ever, in my experience, the perpetrator's personal therapist or psychologist or psychiatrist or doctor or overseer or caregiver, which again does get into patient confidentiality and HIPAA and those kinds of things. So I do respect and understand that can be messy, except in the cases where they're already dead, and then it's easier to get access to these things, and or they're a convicted killer, so it's okay for their psychologist to break confidentiality because, hey, they committed a crime. You can blow the whistle now. It's okay. As well as therapists and caregivers and psychologists, etc., sort of have a legal and moral obligation to report crimes when they're reported to them in therapy sessions. So in that instance, you've already talked to the authorities. There's no real excuse for you not to further talk to, the journalists and the public and the filmmakers and the media, documentarians, etc. Because you've already spilled the beans. What's the fucking point of hiding it now? Which I don't understand, because I used to be a journalist, so I'm on the side of truth. Get the truth out there by any means necessary. Legal means necessary. I'll put that out there. However, the other side of the true crime coin is crime dramas. This would be detective shows, film noir, murder mysteries, things of that sort. So you're talking CSI, you're talking NCIS, Bones, to a lesser extent because it's more comedy, but Psych and Columbo and Murder, She Wrote and stuff like that. Now, this isn't necessarily true crime, although many of these shows do claim that their cases are based on real cases. Sometimes they don't. So Bones did. I believe NCIS does. I don't remember which other ones do or don't. But in this case, under the true crime umbrella, you have fictionalized reenactments of the crimes and the investigations. But like in the case of Law and Order, you end up with less the investigation, more of the prosecution. And with CSI and NCIS and Bones, it's more about the investigation than the prosecution. A lot of times it's, once they're in handcuffs, yay, we saved the day, they're guilty, lock them up. No fucking room in the script or time in the time slot for a trial, for the most part. Although occasionally these shows will have a rare trial episode from time to time, just to kind of spice things up a bit. To that end, I actually did like the first 3 seasons of Bones. And I have to specify the first 3 seasons of Bones. That 4th season was rocky, and I stopped with season 5. Season 4 was rocky. I was just like, why am I watching this? And like 3 or 4 episodes into season 5, I said, you know what? I'm done. I'm not interested anymore. I'm out. I never fucking watched CSI or Law and Order or NCIS or Murder She Wrote or Columbo or any of those fucking shit ass shows. But I did watch Psych, and I want to talk about that briefly. Because Psych never claimed to be based on anything real. And Psych isn't really true crime or even crime drama. It's more of a dramedy, but it's borderline a sitcom. Borderline, but not quite. Psych is about a fake psychic detective who solves crimes for the Santa Barbara Police Department. Not always murders, just sometimes burglaries, sometimes false identities, kidnappings, stolen identity, things like that. If the show was still going today, it would probably be cryptocurrency theft or some bullshit like that, but thank God the show is done before crypto became a thing. And then you have the one I do want to talk about probably the most. You have the actual news. So this comes in the form of initial news reports following the reporting of a crime and what the police know, and reporters who follow the investigation and release information as it becomes available, leading up to the arrest and eventual trial and eventual conviction of the killer. So this is all documented in a public forum. And then you have follow-ups like 60 Minutes and Dateline and things like that, where they go back and look at it all through the lens of, okay, now that we know what we know, let's piece together what happened. As a former journalist and journalism student, I am 100% okay with watching your local news report, including even cable news. I'll watch CNN, MSNBC, not the shitholes. I'm not even going to say their name. But, as far as like breaking news and, general commentary, I'll sometimes check in on what the cable news are saying. But I get most of my news reports through the networks and the local affiliates. Your local station does a better job of journalism than the national news does, because your local station is covering their local community. They have a vested interest in what's going on. The cable networks are just sort of like, they just want the headline and then they want to talk about it for 5 minutes and move on. Because they're just there for the fucking ratings. And then you have the network shows, like I said, 60 Minutes and Dateline are the two prominent examples. I'll watch these shows, even if it is covering a serial killer or a true crime event, if it's one that interests me. And this is partially because, as a journalist, you aspire to do that kind of investigative journalism, which I did get to do a little bit of. As well as, this is a more unfiltered approach to it. The journalists, rather than the documentarians or the true crime filmmakers, are more interested in getting to the actual truth than they are telling a story. The true crime podcasts and TV shows and things like that, they have a narrative they want to pitch, they have a story they want to tell, and they frame their show around that. Whereas by and large, for the most part, the journalists tend to be more fair and balanced and objective. The journalists, not the commentators, there is a difference. Alright, so don't come at me. Okay? But in this regards, I'm not opposed to watching something that is true crime related when it comes to news. Because one, I have a fascination with the news. I do. I worked in the news business for a lot of years. I studied it in college. I got into it in high school. I did the school newspaper and yearbook and all that fun stuff. So I have a deep-rooted fascination with storytelling and journalism and getting to the truth, because that's what I'm all about. So to that regards, yeah, I'm down with watching a Dateline on, a serial killer or a psychopath murderer or whatever. To an extent, for the most part, depending on the subject. Now let's take it a step further and get into the world of biopics and true crime based movies, fictionalized movies based on real events and based on true story movies that are actually based on the true story. So this comes in three flavors, so we'll unpack them one at a time. The first you have is the biopic. This is the based on true story based on a real story. I know that's a mouthful, but yeah, this is a real serial killer and the real victims and the real story of what happened as best we know, depicted in a fictionalized manner using the information we have available to us, sometimes filling in the blanks with filmmakers, intuition or creative license. This would be things like Zodiac or Gacy and things like that. I Am Sam, things like movies like that. Then you have the based on a true story movie that uses the based on a true events tagline in the intro to the movie and in the marketing that is only loosely based on something that may or may not have happened. Usually it's inspired by true events rather than based on true events. So the two examples I want to unpack are the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Actually, three. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Silence of the Lambs, and The Last House on the Left. I've already talked about these three films in previous videos, but let's talk about and also Fargo. Texas Chainsaw Massacre says it's based on true events. This is false with an asterisk. It's loosely inspired by a real life serial killer, but it's a fictionalized reimagining of the events stretched beyond what really happened into the fictional. This is the same thing with Silence of the Lambs, which is also based on pretty much the same serial killer, if I'm not mistaken. As is Psycho, but that's another story for another day. The second one I want to talk about is The Last House on the Left, which is like, sort of. It's loosely inspired by a story that there is no confirmation that it ever happened. So this is basically an urban legend that inspired a movie. A campfire story, if you will. And then there's Fargo, which is a complete fucking fabrication. The filmmakers even said you can make a true based on a true story movie that isn't based on an actual true story. It's just a genre of film, which is what Fargo is. So the events of Fargo never happened. The events of Texas Chainsaw Massacre only kind of loosely, sort of happened in some respects, but not everything. The events of Silence of the Lambs never happened. And the events of Last House on the Left probably never happened. But it can't be confirmed with accuracy because it's based on an urban legend, which is probably somewhere back in time based on something that did really happen, and just through the game of telephone has been exaggerated to the point where it's no longer recognizable as the truth. So this is another type of true crime media that isn't necessarily true crime. Now, for the most part, I'm right okay with these types of movies. Fargo, Last House on the Left, I Know What You Did Last Summer, Psycho, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, etc. I'm right okay with those. Movies based like actual true stories, like biopic style, Zodiac was okay. I'm not interested in Gacy or I Am Sam or the Lizzie Borden story, so I'm not going to watch movies based on those. It just kind of depends on if the source material is interesting and how does the filmmaker present it. Now let's talk about true crime podcasts. I have very, very, very little experience with these. I've only listened to one or two episodes at most of maybe three or four true crime podcasts altogether. Decided it wasn't for me, and I moved on. So I have the fictionalized, exaggerated representation of a true crime podcast as seen in Halloween 2018 and just what I hear on the internets, what I see on Twitter and people talking about it. So as far as true crime podcasts go, I have zero interest. None whatsoever. I will not listen to any of them. Even if it's a great journalist doing the investigative work, even if it's a great person with an awesome radio personality, even if it's a lighthearted and entertaining depiction, whatever. Not interested. True crime podcasts don't appeal to me. So that leads me into my final topic, horror podcasts, of which this is itself. I have listened to quite a few horror podcasts in my day, and by and large, I have a preference. The two formats I prefer are, the first format is the review show. Pick a movie, one movie every episode, weekly, bi-weekly, whatever, and just talk about it. Review it, watch it, review it, give your thoughts on it, get into the making of if you want, the behind the scenes if you want, the history, etc. Have a fun time. Talk about whatever you know about it. If it's a movie I like and have seen or am interested in seeing, I'll listen to it, as long as the host isn't a dull dud, because sometimes they are. The second type of horror podcast I like is the entertainment podcast. This is the one that is more lighthearted, sometimes has a discussion of a movie, but sometimes has like mini games or maybe some true crime mixed in, maybe some news, current events mixed in, but generally more entertaining, more well-rounded, like a TV show, like a newscast or not necessarily an NPR, which I wouldn't listen to because I don't listen to NPR. I'd rather take a shot of rum if I need to take a nap than listen to NPR, because I know I'm just going to fall asleep anyways. And at least with the rum, I get the, subsequent headache and hangover if I drink enough of it. I'm going to go ahead and mention the two podcasts I do listen to, horror podcasts I listen to. They're not the only two podcasts at all that I listen to, but they're the two horror podcasts I like the most. And I'm going to talk briefly about their format because they're interesting, because they have a multi-format show, which I like. The first is Dead Meat Podcast, which was sort of a loose inspiration for this show. Loose because I wanted this to be a companion to the main show, where I could talk about things that don't fit into the main show, which is what the Dead Meat Podcast is. It's a podcast where they're allowed to do things they can't do on the Kill Count, which is their main show. I'm not necessarily trying to emulate that podcast. Obviously, I don't have a co-host, and I don't play mini games and things like that. But it's the loose inspiration for why I wanted to do this podcast in general. What I like about the Dead Meat Podcast is every episode is different. Sometimes they'll do a deep dive into a movie. Well, they'll review the movie and they'll discuss it bit by bit, frame by, or scene by scene, not frame by frame, but scene by scene, and they'll just hit the beats and talk about it as they go. Sometimes they'll do a spoiler-free review of a movie that just came out or is still recent enough they don't want to get into the details. So they'll just talk about their thoughts and feelings and impressions and things like that, or the impact it's had on horror. Sometimes they'll do like list type shows, which I do on my other channel. They'll rank horror movies, or they'll do things like, how do you define a horror movie? And they'll talk about movies that are contentious, that some people say yes or horror, other people say no or not horror, and other people say I don't know, maybe, I guess. They also do fun game show type things, trivia questions and trivia nights and stuff like that, which is entertaining. It also helps that I'm actually a fan of Dead Meat, the channel, and the host and his wife, previously girlfriend and fiance. Um, so I like the co-hosts. They're entertaining and they're intelligent and they're plugged in. So they're informative enough. I enjoy that. I have not listened to every single episode of the Dead Meat podcast. I skip over movies I haven't seen that I want to watch, just like I do on the Kill Count. I also skip over episodes that cover movies or topics I have no interest in. I'm just not going to listen to I'm not going to listen to them talk about the fucking Sixth Sense when I don't give a shit. I just don't give a shit. I'm not going to fucking listen to somebody talk about the Blair Witch Project when I don't give a fuck. I'm not going to listen to that. I don't give a fuck if they like it or not. I don't care. I don't, and I'm not going to listen to them talk about it. The second podcast, horror podcast I listen to, is actually my number one, my favorite podcast out of all podcasts, not just horror podcasts, but the one I follow on social media, the one I interact with the hosts, the one I sometimes support on Patreon when I can afford it and not when I don't, when I can't. Big shout out to Friday the 13th, my favorite podcast of all, and the best horror podcast bar none. Friday the 13th has a consistent formula that only changes occasionally. The formula is they start off with an intro that is sort of a skit, which is usually informative of the topic of the episode, which is usually entertaining, because they're two gay men who are playing gay men on the show in the fictional skits, which are funny as hell. They jump into the news of the day, the horror in real life section, where they talk about things that are horrifying in the news. This is sort of your newsy section, and this isn't horror news. This is real life horror. This is like school shootings, problematic legislation, celebrity deaths occasionally, COVID related stuff, or other diseases or tragedies, hurricanes, natural disasters, whatever's in the news, news, but from a horror person's perspective, horror in real life as it's called. And then they jump into the topic, where whatever the topic is, whether it's sororities or Halloween or serial killers or whatever, corrupt cops, whatever, they go into historical examples of the topic, usually tying it into movies that are relevant to the discussion, movies that are are thematically, or maybe the story of the movie is relevant or whatever. Then they take a break and they do a segment called What You Been Watching, Bitch, where they just talk about the media they've consumed since the last episode. This isn't always horror. Sometimes it's TV shows, sometimes it's books, sometimes it's movies. Rare occasions it's been video games or whatever. And they recap at the end of the segment what the other person watched to kind of give you was it recommended or not. And then they jump into the meat of the episode. They review usually 2, sometimes 3, but mostly 1 or 2 movies that are thematic to the topic. So, for example, when they did, I think it was Broadway is Terrifying or something like that, they reviewed the Rocky Horror Picture Show as an example, when they did like Nightmares Are Terrifying, they did A Nightmare on Elm Street. When they did Summer Camp is Terrifying, they did Friday the 13th. Oh my god, my stupid cat just knocked over my box of toys. And now he's staring at them on the floor like, what did I do? Dumbass. They usually review 2 movies, and they do spoilers. They absolutely do spoilers. They go through the beats, but they don't go in order of sequence of events like they do on Dead Meat. Rather, They pick out the most important parts and talk about those, and then just sort of ramble the rest of it together. And then they play a light-hearted mini game at the end of the episode, which is usually pretty fun. Sometimes it's hottie of the episode, where they pick the individual they thought was the most attractive. Sometimes it's horror trivia type stuff, or sometimes it's guess which crime is real or which thing is real and which one isn't, things like that. It's pretty fun. I wouldn't dare emulate their podcast because it's a great fucking show. You should already be listening to it. If you're not, go check them out. I'm okay with that. I want you to listen to them because they're cool dudes and they're doing good work, especially for the LGBTQ community, which I want to specify. Dead Meat, the hosts are, I believe, former Catholics, so they are coming at it from a Christian slant, at least in terms of their experiences in mythology, etc. The hosts of Friday the 13th are coming at it from a queer perspective, an LGBTQ perspective. And the show is very pro-queer, very queer in its content. So, for example, they have a fictional sorority called Sukadik, which is, suck a dick, basically, that they do skits on. Sorority or fraternity, I don't remember which one. Which is which, because I didn't join a fucking whatever it was when I was in college. So they have that. They are opinionated motherfuckers, and they'll tell it to you how it is. They will not hesitate to say, fuck Donald Trump. Somebody please put a skin-eating virus in his jail cell when he goes to prison, and don't admit to who did it. That kind of shit. Not that they're advocating for violence. I'm just saying they'll tell it how the fuck it is. As do I. So, yeah. Unfortunately, the horror and real life segments, more often than not, because they're a US-based show, actually are mass shootings, which is frustrating as an American on all levels, but also it's kind of like, well, fuck, I gotta listen to them talk about, the problems with America and everything else all over again, which is like, okay, cool, except, we're all tired of hearing this because nothing ever fucking changes and we're so sick and goddamn tired of it. So, yeah, this is my podcast for the week. I hope you got something out of it. I hope you enjoy. Please share the video. If you are listening to this on audio, Spotify or iTunes or wherever you get podcasts, please leave me a review and give me a thumbs up and leave a comment and share the video or the audio file, and let people know that you're listening to the show. And if you don't mind supporting me, don't forget to go to patreon.com/Stephanie Bree. That's StephanieBri, Stephanie Bree, BRI. And throw me a couple bucks. Why not? I have 4 tiers, and you get the same content at each tier, so it's basically how much you want to help me out. $1 a month, $2, $5, whatever. What you get at each tier is you get 2 guaranteed pieces of content. Every month, I do a monthly Zoom, where I do a Q&A. You can ask me anything. It's an Ask Me Anything Q&A. I send you the link through the Patreon platform, so I know that only Patreons are getting the link, and presumably, and we just chat. The other piece of content that is guaranteed is once a month, I promise, I will do a bonus audio commentary, but more often than not, I do it once a week, but it's not guaranteed once a week. It's only guaranteed once a month, but I try to do it once a week just because I like to give you extra content. And because I love to watch horror movies. And so what I do is I watch a horror movie with my friend Gavi, and we just talk about it. We're not riff tracks. We're not Mystery Science Theater 3000. We're not comedians. So we're not ripping it apart. We're just commentating on what we observe and what we see. Sometimes we're poking holes in the plot holes. Sometimes we're commentating on the special effects, good, bad, or indifferent. Sometimes we're talking about that was scary or that wasn't scary, etc. It's just our commentary. It's just our thoughts on the movie. Sometimes there will be trivia and tidbits of knowledge if I have those tidbits in my brain. Otherwise, it's just what I know about the movie or what I'm seeing as I watch it if it's one I've never seen before. So do sign up for the Patreon for that. Those are fun. The next movie I'm going to be doing is Jurassic Park, which I know is contentious because some people are going to say that's not horror. I know, but it's a monster movie, so whatever. And I don't only do horror movies because the Patreon is actually for all three of my channels. But I try to pick horror movies for the most part, or horror adjacent movies for the most part, because that's where my interest lies. But it's always going to be a movie I either want to watch or have an interest in or have already seen and did enjoy, for the most part. Occasionally, I'll get tricked into doing Sharknado, which I did recently and regret, but that's pretty rare. And no, it's not riff tracks, and it's not director commentary or anything like that. It's not like me talking about, in this scene, this happened or whatever, because I wasn't there. I don't fucking know. It's just entertainment. Stay cool.